Who could be knocking on Christmas Eve? Kristin Hayes barely had time to ask herself before opening the door to find a group of lawyers holding a file with her name printed on it. Just an hour earlier, she had brought food and a gift to a grieving elderly man, expecting nothing in return. What followed would transform her life completely. Before we dive into the story, comment below where you're watching from. Enjoy the story, everyone. Snowflakes floated down over the quiet streets of Maple Hill, dusting rooftops and sidewalks with soft white. Inside cozy homes, families gathered for Christmas Eve, laughter and music spilling into the chilly air. But one house stood dark and still. Kristin wrapped her scarf tighter as she passed the old Victorian estate at the corner of Chestnut Lane. No wreath, no string lights, only stillness. She slowed as she stepped onto the porch. There sat an elderly man in a rocking chair, staring blankly ahead. His white hair was neatly combed, his wool coat buttoned, but there was a deep hollowness behind his eyes. She recognized him, Mr. Edward Langston, once a powerful business figure and one of the wealthiest men in town. But after the tragic loss of his wife and only son, he had withdrawn completely, disappearing from public view. And now on Christmas Eve he sat alone. Kristin hesitated. She understood what it meant to feel invisible. At 33, working as a community outreach coordinator, she had met far too many people who had been left behind. Not tonight. Turning back toward town, she walked quickly to the Maple Diner, a cozy spot open late for the holiday. 10 minutes later, she returned carrying a hot dinner, a to-go cup of cocoa, and a small wrapped gift. She climbed the porch steps and knocked gently. Silence. Then soft footsteps. The door creaked open. Edward stood there, his eyes alert but tired. His voice came low and flat. If you're here to sell something, I'm not interested. Kristin gave a warm smile and held up the bag. Not selling anything, Mr. Langston. I just thought. She paused, unsure how to continue. No one should spend Christmas alone. His eyes shifted between her and the food, one hand gripping the edge of the door. And what do you expect in return? Nothing, she said quietly. There was a long pause. Then, with a heavy sigh, he stepped aside. Come in before you catch cold. Kristin stepped into the hallway. It was grand, elegant, but devoid of life, like a memory sealed in time. No garlands. No tree. Only silence. They moved into the sitting room where a small fire flickered in the hearth. Edward eased into a chair while Kristin placed the meal on the nearby table. It's not fancy, but it's warm, she said. Edward regarded her for a moment, then picked up the cocoa. No one's brought me Christmas dinner in over a decade. Kristin smiled softly. Well then, I'd say it's about time. For the first time in many years, Edward Langston shared a Christmas Eve dinner with another person. At first, his words were few, careful. But as the warmth of the fire and the meal settled in, so did something deeper, comfort. He began to speak about his wife, his son, and the life he used to have. Kristin didn't interrupt. She didn't offer pity. She just listened with compassion and quiet understanding. When they finished eating, Kristin reached into her coat pocket and handed him the small wrapped box. Edward stared at it. What's this? She shrugged. Just a little something. He hesitated before setting it beside him on the end table. As midnight approached, Kristin rose to leave. Thank you for letting me stay, she said. I know this probably wasn't part of your plan tonight. Edward let out a slow breath. Neither was Christmas. Her heart tightened. At least he hadn't spent it in silence. As she walked toward the door, he called out gently, Miss Hayes. Kristin turned. His voice softened. Thank you. She smiled at him, eyes kind. Merry Christmas, Mr. Langston. Then she stepped back into the frosty night, unaware that her life had just taken a dramatic turn. In exactly 1 hour, a knock at her door would shift her world forever. Kristin made her way home through the quiet streets of Maple Hill, the cold nipping at her cheeks. A soft snowfall had begun again, blanketing the neighborhood in a sparkling, fresh layer. Despite the chill, she felt warmer inside than she had in months. She hadn't expected much out of the evening. In fact, she hadn't even planned to stop by Edward Langston's home. But something in her gut had urged her to knock. And in that dim sitting room she had seen a faint light return to a man long lost in grief. She smiled slightly as she reached her modest apartment, brushing snowflakes from her shoulders. Maybe it meant nothing. Maybe tomorrow he'd retreat into solitude, pretending none of it ever happened. But for one night, he hadn't been alone. She dropped her purse on the table, kicked off her boots, and was just about to make tea when a loud knock echoed through her small space. Kristin froze. It was after midnight. Who would knock at this hour? Cautiously, she moved to the door. Through the peephole, she spotted 2 men in dark coats, serious, professional-looking. Her stomach knotted. Lawyers. Kristin opened the door cautiously. The older man, dressed in a navy overcoat and leather gloves, gave her a courteous nod. He held a thick envelope with gold lettering. "Miss Hayes?" Kristin's pulse quickened. "Yes. I'm Nathan Cole, Mr. Edward Langston's legal counsel. He's asked to see you right away." Kristin blinked in disbelief. "Mr. Langston? Is he all right?" "He's well," Nathan assured her, "but he was very clear that we needed to come immediately." Kristin glanced at the second man, then back at Nathan. Why would Edward want to see her again so soon? Earlier that evening, he had barely spoken to her. Now he was summoning her past midnight? She hesitated for a second, but there was something urgent and respectful in Nathan's tone that convinced her. "All right, just give me a moment to grab my coat." Minutes later, she sat in the back of a sleek black sedan, watching snowy storefronts slide by. Her mind raced, trying to piece together what this could be about. By the time they pulled up to the familiar mansion, her hands were cold with nerves despite the warm air inside the car. The house looked just as it had before, still, shadowed, and strangely imposing. Nathan led her up the icy steps and gave a firm knock. To her surprise, the heavy door opened almost immediately. Edward Langston stood there, looking more awake, more focused than before. His eyes met hers without hesitation. "Come in," he said simply. Kristin stepped inside, exchanging a glance with Nathan, then followed Edward into the same sitting room as earlier. The fire now blazed higher, casting golden light across the elegant walls. Edward eased into his chair and gestured for her to sit opposite. Her heart pounded as she lowered herself onto the couch. "Mr. Langston, what's going on?" He rubbed his hands together slowly, gathering his thoughts. For a moment, she wondered if he might change his mind about whatever this was. Finally, he spoke. "I haven't trusted anyone in a long time, Miss Hayes. After losing my wife and my boy, I learned the hard way that people don't always come with good intentions. The friends I once had vanished overnight. They only saw the wealth." Kristin nodded gently, unsure where the conversation was headed. Edward's voice steadied. "But tonight you didn't come to ask for anything. You had no idea who I used to be. You saw a man sitting alone on Christmas Eve and brought him dinner. You stayed. You listened. And you never once expected something in return." Kristin felt emotion stir deep in her chest. Nathan stepped forward, placing the thick envelope on the table between them. Edward took a breath. "I won't dance around it. I don't have much time left." Kristin's eyes widened. "Are you sick?" He shook his head slightly. "The doctors won't give me a clear answer, but I feel it. And I've spent years preparing. The only thing I couldn't decide was who to leave it all to." Kristin froze, suddenly breathless. "I have no family. No heirs. My attorneys have revised my will again and again, and I've never signed it. But tonight, I finally did." He nodded toward the envelope. "Everything is in there. And it's for you." Silence hung in the air. Kristin's voice came out shaky. I don't understand." "You don't have to," Edward said calmly. "Out of everyone I've ever known, you were the only one who showed up expecting nothing." Kristin's thoughts spun. "This doesn't make any sense. We barely know each other." Nathan interjected, his tone neutral. "Miss Hayes, Mr. Langston's estate is currently valued at over $72 million. Kristin nearly dropped the envelope. Edward leaned forward, his gaze softer now. "I'm not asking you to run off and live in luxury. I've seen your heart. You give. You care. That's why I chose you." Kristin's hands trembled as she looked at the documents. It's too much." Edward smiled faintly. "Just say you'll think about it." Deep down, Kristin knew her life had changed forever the moment she stepped onto Edward Langston's porch. Kristin sat upright on the edge of a large leather armchair in Edward Langston's quiet sitting room, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The warmth from the crackling fire barely touched the chill in her fingers. Across from her, Edward rested both hands on the thick envelope lying on the polished table between them. He studied her in thoughtful silence before speaking again. "What did you do tonight, Kristin?" His voice was calm, but the question caught her off guard. Kristin frowned slightly. "I brought you dinner. A small gift. It wasn't much, but I thought," she hesitated, "I thought no one should be alone on Christmas." Edward didn't look away. "And why did you feel that way?" Kristin blinked. "Because it just felt like the right thing to do." The silence that followed was long but not uncomfortable. The fire crackled behind them. Then Edward's lips curved, just barely, into something like a smile, quiet, real, and unguarded. "Do you know how many people have knocked on this door in the last 10 years? He asked. Kristin shook her head. "None." Her breath caught. Edward looked toward the fire, the light reflecting off his tired features. When my wife passed, I stopped inviting people in. When my son died, I stopped believing in them altogether. And eventually, the world stopped knocking. He glanced back at her. Until tonight. Kristin felt her throat tighten. I've had money, Edward continued, more than I ever needed. But I've spent years watching it sit there, useless. People see it, see me, and they start pretending. They smile, flatter, and take. But in the end, they all want one thing. Kristin looked at him carefully. And what's that? Edward's eyes locked on hers. Something in return. The words hung in the air between them. But you, he said more softly now. You gave without expecting anything. You didn't even know who I was. You just saw a man sitting in the cold, and you made the choice to care. Kristin felt a ripple of emotion rise inside her. A strange mix of humility, unease, and something deeper she couldn't yet name. Edward slowly slid the envelope closer. Which is why I'm giving you this. She hesitated before picking it up. The heavy paper felt cool and serious in her hands. She opened it, flipping through the thick stack of legal documents inside. Her name, Kristin Hayes, was printed at the top of the first page. She turned to the next sheet, her breath hitching. It was a formal will. A very real, very binding will. Her voice cracked. Mr. Langston, this isn't something I can accept. Edward let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. You don't really have a choice. I've already signed it. She slid the papers back across the table. But I barely know you. He leaned back, hands folded together. And yet, you're the only person who's ever truly seen me. Kristin clenched her jaw. I don't want your money, Edward. That's not why I know, he interrupted gently but firmly. She looked down, her voice low. This is just overwhelming. Edward leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. I'm not asking you to take it and vanish into some lavish life. I know you, Kristin. I've seen enough to believe you're someone who gives, not takes. That's why this is for you. Kristin shook her head slowly, her thoughts spinning. I'm not prepared for something like this. I wouldn't even know where to begin. Edward studied her carefully. Then he asked, if you had the means to change lives, not just get by, but truly help others, would you? Kristin looked up, startled. I spent decades building something, he continued. Now I want to leave it in the hands of someone who will actually use it to make a difference. Kristin's fingers curled around the edge of the envelope. Edward waited patiently. So tell me, Kristin, if this wasn't for you, but for the people who need it most, what would you do with it? Kristin exhaled shakily. She had spent years fighting to help others on a shoestring budget. Families barely holding on, seniors forgotten in rundown buildings, kids going to bed hungry. If I could, she said at last, I'd help them all. Edward gave a slow nod. Then it settled. Kristin's chest tightened. Edward, this is still so much. It doesn't feel real. Does it have to? He asked softly. You've spent your life pouring from an empty cup. This, he motioned toward the documents. This fills it. Kristin stared down at her name bold across the top of the paperwork. Her hands trembled as she touched the page. Edward's voice dropped to a quiet murmur. This was never about money. It's about the impact it can have in the right hands. A part of her still wanted to run, to say no, to pretend this wasn't happening. But a deeper part, the one that had made her knock on his door in the first place, whispered, this is why you're here. She looked up, meeting his eyes. This isn't just about me, is it? Edward smiled softly. No, he said. It never was. Kristin let out a slow breath as the weight of the moment settled over her. Her entire world had shifted with one choice, one knock on a stranger's door. Now she stood at the edge of something far bigger than herself. I don't know how to lead something like this, she admitted. This was your life's work, Edward. Your name. Your legacy. I'm just someone who cares. Edward gave a quiet laugh. And that, Kristin, is rarer than you think. She looked around the room, the towering shelves, the antique furniture, the crackling fire. All of it a monument to a lifetime of wealth, and yet it had stood empty for years. You're asking me to be responsible for more money than I've ever imagined, she whispered. Edward nodded once. Yes. And I wouldn't ask if I didn't believe you could. Kristin looked back at him, still overwhelmed, still uncertain, but no longer frozen. Kristin leaned forward, her voice barely a whisper. If I hadn't knocked on your door tonight, what would you have done? Edward's lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't answer, he didn't have to. The truth was written all over his face. He let out a shaky breath, rubbing his hands together. I've been waiting, Kristin. waiting for something, anything that would make me believe there are still people in this world who care without needing a reason. Kristin glanced down at the papers once more, her name printed in firm black letters. The weight of the envelope felt heavier now. "All right," she said after a long pause. "I'll do it." Edward didn't move at first. Then his brow arched ever so slightly. "I assume there's a condition?" Kristin smiled faintly. "You're coming with me." He blinked. "Kristin, I'm an old man." "I." She didn't let him finish. "No. You don't get to disappear into that house again. If I'm doing this, we're doing it." For a long beat, there was only the sound of the fire crackling. Then a soft laugh, quiet but genuine. "You're persistent," he muttered. Kristin grinned. "So I've heard." Edward shook his head, but a light sparked behind his eyes. "All right, Kristin. You've got yourself a deal." The next few months changed everything. Edward's once empty mansion became a center of motion and purpose. Kristin devoted herself to researching causes, designing programs, and meeting with local leaders. For the first time in years, Edward Langston had a reason to get up each morning. Together, they founded the Christmas Kindness Foundation, an organization dedicated to making sure no one in Maple Hill felt forgotten, especially during the holidays. At first, people were skeptical. After all, Edward Langston had been invisible for years. But as he showed up at food drives, shelters, and town hall meetings, minds began to change. They started small, grocery grants for struggling families, heating assistance for seniors, holiday meals delivered to doorsteps. Kristin and Edward visited shelters and listened to stories that broke their hearts and drove their mission. As the snow melted and spring arrived, Maple Hill began to believe. The once reclusive millionaire was no longer a ghost. He was present. He was real. And so was the foundation that bore their vision. 1 year later, Christmas Eve returned, but this time, Edward Langston's estate wasn't quiet and dark. It shimmered with light, warmth, and life. Twinkling lights lined the fences. Long banquet tables stretched across the lawn, filled with hot meals and wrapped gifts. The town square had been transformed into a winter festival, and the first annual Christmas Kindness celebration was in full swing. Hundreds gathered, families, seniors, children, volunteers. Some were here for a warm meal. Others for company. Laughter floated in the cold night air. Edward stood near the center, watching it all unfold. Kristin appeared beside him, a wool coat buttoned snugly, cheeks flushed from the cold. "Well," she said with a grin, nudging his shoulder, "we actually pulled it off." Edward chuckled. "Correction, you pulled it off." Kristin gave him a sideways glance. "Nice try. But this was never just mine." Edward exhaled slowly, his eyes scanning the crowd, the food, the hugs, the warmth. "You know," he said quietly, "I used to believe money was my greatest asset." Kristin tilted her head toward him. "And now?" Edward smiled softly. "Now I know the greatest gift is having something worth giving." Kristin felt a lump form in her throat. For the first time in years, Edward Langston had everything that wealth couldn't buy: connection, purpose, and family. She reached for his hand and gave it a gentle squeeze. "Merry Christmas, Edward." His voice was calm, filled with quiet joy. "Merry Christmas, Kristin." The town square shimmered under golden lights. Snow drifted slowly, resting on rooftops and the shoulders of volunteers. Lampposts were wrapped in garlands, and music floated from a local quartet playing holiday songs near the fountain. Kristin stood near the center of it all, her heart full. A year ago, she had knocked on a stranger's door. Tonight, she stood at the heart of a movement. Long tables overflowed with hot meals and sweets. Children opened gifts beside a glowing Christmas tree. Volunteers handed out mittens and care packages. Laughter and gratitude filled the air as neighbors who had once been strangers came together. And in the middle of it all stood Edward, no longer hidden, no longer forgotten. Kristin watched from a distance as Edward crouched beside an elderly woman in a wheelchair, listening attentively. A man shook his hand and clapped him on the back in thanks. People surrounded him, not for what he had, but for what he now gave. He looked different now, lighter somehow. The burden of years spent in silence had lifted. Kristin made her way toward him, but before she could reach him, he turned as if sensing her approach. "There she is," he said, teasing. "The woman who refuses to let me enjoy retirement." Kristin laughed. "You love it and you know it." Edward smirked. "Maybe. But don't spread that around. I've got a reputation to protect." "Too late," Kristin said. "Everyone here knows the truth." Edward looked out across the crowd. His smirk softened. "They really do, don't they?" Before Kristin could respond, a little girl appeared at Edward's side, no older than 6. She clutched something wrapped in brown paper. "Mr. Langston?" she asked shyly. Edward bent slightly, his voice unusually gentle. "Yes, sweetheart?" She held out the small bundle. "This is for you." Mommy said you help lots of people and I wanted to say thank you. Edward hesitated before slowly accepting the gift, his fingers trembling slightly as he unwrapped it. Inside was a handmade ornament, a simple red heart painted slightly crooked but full of love. His voice caught. "It's for your Christmas tree," the girl said brightly. Edward blinked. I don't have a tree." Her eyes widened. "Not even a little one?" Kristin stepped in. "He does now." Edward glanced at her. She grinned. "I bought one for your house this morning. You didn't really think I'd let you get away with another Christmas without one, did you?" Edward chuckled, shaking his head. "You really don't give up, do you?" Kristin folded her arms with a playful look. "Not even a little." The little girl giggled, then reached forward and gave Edward a quick hug around the waist before running back to her mother. Edward watched her go, his expression unreadable until Kristin gently nudged him. "You all right?" she asked. He looked down at the handmade ornament in his hand. "I never thought I'd receive another Christmas gift." Kristin smiled, her eyes soft. "Get used to it." Edward held the ornament for a moment longer, then carefully tucked it into the inside pocket of his coat, his hand resting protectively over it. "I think I will," he murmured. The band in the square struck up a lively carol. Kristin turned to look at the crowd. "This is incredible," she whispered. "Just look at what we've created." Edward followed her gaze. All around them, people shared meals, laughter, warmth. Elderly neighbors chatted by fire pits. Families connected. Teenagers carried bags to cars for older guests. No one was alone. 1 year ago, Edward's house had been steeped in silence. Now it was overflowing with light, music, and life. Kristin looked at him. "You know this is just the beginning, right?" Edward sighed in mock defeat. "You're never going to let me slow down, are you?" She shook her head. "Not a chance." But there was no resistance in his voice now, only quiet gratitude. He looked at her, eyes warm. "I used to think my wealth was the most important thing I had." Kristin raised an eyebrow. "And now?" Edward smiled. "Now I know the greatest gift isn't wealth, it's purpose." Kristin reached out and rested her hand on his shoulder. "Merry Christmas, Edward." He placed his hand gently over hers. "Merry Christmas, Kristin." And as the snow swirled around them and the sound of laughter filled the glowing town square, Edward Langston, the man who once lived in shadows, finally understood what it meant to be home.